I'm going to talk about a mermaid today. So, some of the cover page stories, I've decided that I will do kind of a pair video with them, as in like a character that is either introduced in that cover page series, like in this case, I'm going to talk about Camie, and she is, of course, introduced in Hachan's Seafloor Stroll. And while I did talk about her during that, I kind of wanted to do a bit more in depth about just kind of her story, and tangentially Pappag, because reasons. So that. I'm not going to go back because there wasn't really a lot of other characters. I might technically go back and do one for Hina in regards to like the one for Django, because that's where Hina is introduced and then we see her subsequently. But we'll see. I might tag her on to a different one. And we'll see kind of which other cover page series has a character in it that's either introduced, that would be a good one to discuss there, or at the very least is a cover page series where I haven't already talked about this. For example, when I get around to the, German double sixes Emotionless Excursion, I've already talked about pretty much everybody there. There's not really that many people. I've talked about Sanji's dad and his siblings, so there's not really anybody there I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about Caesar, so no. And then, like, same thing with Wano. When I get through, like, Yamato's cover page story, when I get to that, there's not really anybody there who's introduced who I haven't already done a video about, except for Yamato. And I do eventually want to do a video, if not several videos, about Yamato. So we'll see how that goes. But today we're going to talk about Camie and Pappag. So Camie is a... Ignore him in the background. I'm sorry. Is a kissing gourami mermaid. The type of fish. This is what the fish looks like. As I said, she is introduced in Hachan's Seafloor Stroll. She then, of course, encounters the Straw Hats later during Saba Odi. She, of course, works at Hachan's takoyaki stand for a while, and then eventually she ends up working at the Mermaid Cafe. She is a mermaid. Not too much else there. She's not royalty. She does end up befriending the princess. We'll go over that later. Going through, she is 18 years old, so she's 16 when we meet her. She's the same age as Vivi in the story. So we get that. And then we have, I did want to put on Pappag's age here. Pappag is 33. We don't know exactly how long he's known Camie. How long, like, he's been her pet. It's possible he belonged to, like, maybe one of Camie's parents, because we do see them together when Camie is very young, like 8 or like 10 or so in the series. We'll get to that in a minute. But they've been around each other for a long time, for probably a good chunk of Camie's life, if not the majority of Camie's life at this point in time. And Pappag is very, very supportive of Camie. I will point this out, just because it is something that gets pointed out in the series. As I said, Pappag is technically Camie's pet, but he also is a fashion designer, and he is the creator of the criminal fashion brand, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on in the video, but like, he is the creator of that and the owner of that brand. So he is a very talented starfish. Also, in the fact that he is a starfish, he technically shouldn't have a voice box. So he shouldn't be able to talk, which he does, nor sing, which he does, which is impressive. And he's just like, yeah, no, I'm a starfish, and I really, really wanted to learn how to talk and sing. So he did. He pulled a Meowth from Team Rocket. He pulled a Meowth from Pokemon. Meowth wanted to learn how to talk human talk, so he did. This starfish did the same thing. Impressive. Very well done there. So we have that. He sings. He plays a guitar. He talks. He designs fashion. Very talented starfish. No argument here. Okay, now we're going to go into Camie's history. So, the earliest in the series that we technically see Camie is when she is 8 years old. Or, excuse me, when she's 10 years old, about 8 years before the beginning of the series. We see her and Pappag are handing in their signatures. They're part of the crowd giving their signatures to Queen Otohime's petition for, Fishman Island to be able to, join the upper world type of a thing. And so we see them there, like little Camie and little Pappag. Well, it'd be little Camie and like 25-year-old Pappag, I guess, are there. There is also something, and I don't remember how much of this was added in the anime or if it was just something that like they heightened from what was in the manga. We also know that Camie has dreamed about being able to go to Sabaody and be able to go to the Sabaody theme park and the amusement park and all of that stuff since she was a little girl. We get this like little flashback during Sabaody when she's in the Ferris wheel where it's like her up at the surface, like looking at the Ferris, at the amusement park lit up at night and how it just looks so magical and beautiful and how she just dreamed of being able to go there. But of course, it was way too dangerous for her to be able to go there because she's a mermaid. Why will be very, very evident in a little while. So we have that. So about that, those are like the two earliest depictions that we get of Camie. Is her when she's about 10, and then like her as like a little bit younger than that, looking at Sabaody and wanting to be able to go to the theme park. Love you, girl. Then we get into where she is actually officially introduced in Hachan's seafloor stroll. So at some point in time, while Camie and Pappag were traveling the seafloor, they end up getting eaten by a large sea boar on the seafloor. And the creature, while they're inside of it, ends up getting eaten by a Leviathan monster, and then via shenanigans, it ends up like bleh-ing them up in front of Hachan, who then like helps them. And so they meet Hachan during the seafloor stroll. And they kind of befriend each other, and they're like, hey, we're Camie, we're Pappag, blah 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 blah, get introduced to each other. This section I went over this in much more detail during the Hachan's one, so we'll just kind of skip over bits of it. But so what ends up happening is, of course, Hachan and Camie kind of, they get introduced to each other, blah blah blah, and then the macro pirates show up, and they essentially are like, hey, Hachan, we know you. Hey, I know you really like takoyaki. Here's a map to a takoyaki thing. If you give us the girl. Hachi makes that decision stupidly because he's blinded by takoyaki. And they take Camie because the macro pirates have been chasing Camie for who knows how long. Excuse me. Have been chasing Camie for who knows how long. And of course, they are fishmen who are trying to capture her so they can sell her into slavery, which is just this whole big bad cycle that, of course, is something that is, very much not touched upon in One Piece, but very focused on in One Piece. And what ends up happening is, they take her and they're gonna, sell her off and everything. However, Hachan returns, beats them up, destroys their ship because he thinks they lied to him about the takoyaki because he can't find the takoyaki. He just finds a giant squid or a giant octopus guarding something. And they're like, no, it really was there. So then Hachan goes back. This time he has Camie with him. He's freed her unintentionally in the process of like destroying their ship. And Hachan and Camie and Pappag go back to where the octopus was. They find that, there is this takoyaki sauce hidden in the thing's cap. I'm like, okay. So their intention is to take that along with all of the treasure that they took from Macro and all of that. And then they end up coming across the Headband Catfish Village. And of course, it was kind of destroyed recently by like an earthquake or whatever. So they're very hungry and they need help rebuilding. And Camie, of course, feels bad for them. And this is where we get a little bit more of like, what are you doing, Hachan, for a second, because he runs off, swims off with like all of the stuff that they have, and they think that he abandoned them again, but he returns and he's got all these supplies for like takoyaki and everything. So then they make takoyaki with Camie and Pappag handing it out to the citizens of the Headband Catfish Village, and all of that. So they're feeding all the Headband Catfish Village and everything else like that. Then eventually we have Octopako shows up. Hachan makes the decision between giving the girl that he has a huge crush on and the elder of the Catfish Village the last bit of Octopako, or last bit of takoyaki, gives it to the Catfish Elder. Octopako does not like this. She beats him up. And, Octopako, and, she's just kind of a bitch anyway. So, yeah. So we deal with that. Camie and Pappag try to comfort Hachan in the fact that that Octopako doesn't like him anymore, type of thing, and that she's just very snooty and everything. So they kind of, try to, comfort Hachan into the evening, and eventually they all fall asleep on this island, on this little island. And then the next day, the catfish show back up, and they are actually like shipwrights, carpenters, and they build him a takoyaki stand that is his like takoyaki 8. That he then uses to go around and sell takoyaki, and Camie and Pappag travel with him. So we have that continuation there. Again, that part I literally went over in a lot more detail in the actual video of the cover page series. So jumping around a little bit there, but still. Then we get into the Sabaody Archipelago, and this is where Camie ends up meeting the Straw Hats. So similarly to how she met Hachan, she ends up inside of, I think it's a giant sea rabbit at this point in time. Camie and Pappag had gotten lost from Hachan, and they got eaten by a giant sea king, and they were swallowed up for like the 20th time or whatever. But they were saved again from being digested. Essentially, there's like this, not cat and mouse, but it's like Macro and his crew keep trying to capture Camie. It's like an absurd number of times, like Team Rocket trying to capture Pikachu, or as we found out more recently, the God's Knights trying to get baby Shanks back from the Roger Pirates and failing every single time, and getting their butts kicked. So Hachan keeps protecting Camie and Pappag. This point in time, they've gotten separated. Hachan has also been captured by Macro and the Flying Fish Riders, by Duval and his crew at that point in time. So, and they're going to use him as bait to lure Camie there. So what ends up happening is they got, Camie and Pappag get separated from Hachan. They get eaten by like the Sea King. And then they end up getting saved from the Sea King by the Straw Hats as they are trying to figure out where they need to go once they reach the Red Line, because they need to get to Fishman Island, but they don't know how to do that. So they end up, attacking the Sea King, and the Sea King spits out Camie and Pappag, which Camie ends up falling directly on Sanji because reasons. On a love-struck Sanji because mermaid, all of it. And so we get that, and we get this, the Straw Hats get introduced to Camie and to Pappag, and she's just like so thankful to them. And we get this funny bit where she's like, she's so grateful to them, she's going to award them by selling them takoyaki. And then Pappag's like, yeah, no, that's not how that works. And she's like, oh my god, I'm so sorry. So she's just like, anytime she makes like this weird social faux pas, she's like, sorry. Because Camie is awkward, but she is adorable. So Sanji is, of course, just, oh my god, mermaid, and she's pretty. And even though they literally met Kokoro already, they literally are like, yeah, no, Camie is the first and only mermaid we have ever met. We don't know that Kokoro is a mermaid. Why would we know that? Whole bit there. Just that whole bit. Just that. So we get that. And so we have all of that. Just like they completely forget that Kokoro was a mermaid at that point in time, because weird and disturbing reasons. Um, so they're then like, okay, how are we gonna work with this? And they're like, okay, well, we have Camie, and like, she's like, well, I need your guys' help because my friend got captured by these other guys in like the Den Den Wishy rings, and it's Hachan on the other side, and like he's been kidnapped by Macro and his crew. So she's like, hey, can you guys help me save my friend Tachi? And they're like, I guess we can do that. That's not a problem. So they end up needing to get to where like the flying fish riders base, so that way they can, save Hachan or save Hachi. And I will point this out here, and I pointed it out prior. When they are on the phone, when they are on the Den Den Mushi with Hachan, with Hachi, as he gets referred to, Nami is like, we see Nami have the reaction to his voice, and she's kind of like she's like, okay, I know that voice, I recognize that voice, but it can't be. Is kind of like her, like she's like, I guess it could be, but I don't know. So she's recognizing that he sounds very much like the Hachan that she knows, of course, from the Arlong Pirates. And she is kind of worried a little bit that maybe this is Hachan. And she would be much less likely to want to help Hachan because of their past. But she's not sure yet, so they're still going to go help Camie. She does not voice any of this to the rest of the crew. She's just like keeping her suspicions to herself at this point in time, because if it doesn't end up being him and it's just some other fishman that sounds like him, then so be it. We'll help them. Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. So they're trying to figure out like how they're going to get to him, and they're like, well, we can't really sail very easily. And Camie's like, oh, that's fine, I can ask the fish for help. I'm sorry, what? So she's just essentially like, because she's a mermaid, they can communicate with fish. And she asked the fish to help them be able to make their way to where they need to go to get to where Hachan is, to where Hachi is, where he's been captured. So they start heading that way. The fish show up, and they're like, yeah, follow us this way. And they make like an arrow that they follow. And they're starting making their way there. And they get to pretty close to where they become the Rosy Life Riders, but they're the Flying Fish Riders at this point in time. They get close to there, and like they kind of get ambushed, and then it's like trying to lead them into a trap type of a thing. And they get there, and it's like, okay, that's far enough. Now, if you want Hachan back, Hachi back, then blah 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 blah. And they're threatening Hachan, and they're like, so all of that stuff. And what ends up happening is Hachan has realized that these are the Straw Hats, and he's like, oh no, that's not good. So he has essentially like doused himself in ink, so that way he's not as recognizable, because he of course knows that that's Nami. And even if Nami isn't there, Luffy is. And Luffy and the others who know about what happened in Kokoyashi Village may not be forgiving to Hachan. So Hachan has figured this out very quickly. Camie, on the other hand, does not know any of this for the backstory here, for like this connection here between Nami and Hachi. So it's essentially, there ends up being this revelation where like it is revealed that this is Hachan, and yeah, that is who it was. And they're like, okay. And Camie is just shocked. She's like, oh, you guys know Hachi, that's great. And then like Zoro like looks at her and is like, no, that's not a good thing. He was our enemy in the past. Him and Arlong had Nami enslaved, essentially, and we had to fight them in order to free her and her village. Or essentially what happens, and Camie gets like scared of that. And they're like Robin, Frankie, and Brooke and Chopper don't really know that much about what's going on here, but they understand that this was something that happened that was very important to the crew and to Nami, and such. So they kind of, even the others kind of default to Nami to let her decide what's going on here, because this is specifically connected to her. I mean, like, Zoro fought Hachi, but, not really that much there that they had to deal with in regards to, antagonistic relationship there. But so Nami is kind of like like, she is debating about it. Um, you know, she's like, fine, Camie's like, oh, okay. And she kind of feels abandoned because of this, or she feels like maybe they won't help her anymore. So she decides that she's going to free Hachan on her own. Her and Pappag are. So they get ready and they dive off the ship and they are immediately captured into the clutches of Macro and his crew. However, because of course the Straw Hats are not one to then just let this new girl that they met be kidnapped, they're like, they decide to help her, save both her and Hachan, regardless of past experiences, because, reasons. Because they're essentially good people. Depending on where you want to put them on a morality scale, take your pick. But they are essentially good people. They've had to do stuff that they needed to do to survive in regards to like Robin and Frankie. They've had, and like even, Nami gets thrown in there for stuff that they had to do to survive given their lot in life, but they are good people. And so Luffy jumps, pulls Camie Pappag away, rescues them, lands on like the dock of the Flying Fish Riders base. Luffy is keeping Camie and such safe. They then work on getting Hachan free of the cage that he's in. They deal with Duval, and there's like the whole fight that's going on there. Hachi, I believe, beats up Macro and his crew at that point in time. And at one point in time, because of course it's revealed that, Duval's grudge is not against the Straw Hats specifically, it's against Sanji, because of course Duval's actual face looks like Sanji's wanted poster. The horribly drawn wanted poster. So there's that, which is just funny. And of course, so we have that whole thing where it's like Duval versus Sanji, which results in face kicking plastic surgery. So we get that, but there's also the moment where Sanji ends up falling into the water and he ends up getting trapped in like one of the metal nets that is pulling him down. And they're like, oh my god, we gotta save Sanji. And Camie is actually the one who dives into the water because it's just like, who's gonna be the fastest one to be able to get him? Camie. So Camie dives into the water, is swimming after Sanji. There's a little bit of tension where you're trying to find out if she got to him. And she did. We see her swim to the surface, and she's got Sanji. And because reasons, for the way that she's holding him, his head is in her boobs, and nosebleed because Sanji. So we have that. Does fit, kicking plastic reconstructive surgery on Duval. Everybody's safe. Everybody's happy. And it then goes into, okay, now we're going to actually like thank the Straw Hats by making them takoyaki. So Hachan, Camie, and Pappag are like making and giving the Straw Hats, a bunch of free takoyaki and everything else like that. And of course, they're just like downing it because it tastes delicious. And we do have the moment where like, and Camie is watching this, they have the moment where Hachan asks Nami whether or not she likes the takoyaki, and he does a whole, just because you like the takoyaki, if the takoyaki is good, that's great. I just wanted to know if you like it. It doesn't mean that you have to forgive me. Because he understands where he's coming from now. And, Nami does the whole thing of like, I don't know, does the whole thing of like, well, no, I haven't forgiven you yet, but the takoyaki is very tasty. And he's like, yay, he's like happy about that. So it's like we have that, that little bit of something there. Then we get to the point where it is now the Straw Hats need to get to Sabaody. Because we get like this conversation where Hachan and Camie are like discussing stuff with the Straw Hats, and they're like, okay, well, yeah, you need to get down to Fishman Island because that's where the log post is pointing, because that's the next step. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to get to because you have to go underwater, like 10,000 meters or whatever underwater, in order to get to Fishman Island. And of course, water pressure would just, your boat at that point in time, no matter what type of a ship you have, is just gonna go. So they're like, okay, well, you need to go to Sabaody because you're gonna need to get your ship coated in the resin at Sabaody, so that way it can go underwater and you can get down to Fishman Island. And he's like, thankfully, I know a guy who lives there who can help you with this. This is, of course, referring to Rayleigh. And so they're like, yeah, we can take you to Sabaody and, we can tell you, help you get there and blah, 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 blah. So they're like, okay, that works great. So head off to Sabaody. And what ends up happening is they're like, oh, this place is awesome. And they're like explaining, well, it's not actually an island. It's a mangrove of giant trees that are, well, we find out that they're branches of like the sunlight tree Eve and everything else like that. We kind of learn about that later. But they're, giant mangroves that like release like this bubble resin that is then used to, coat ships, and they use it for a lot of other things around Sabaody because of just how it's designed and how useful it is. So we see a lot of that there. They, of course, then kind of break into different groups as they're going to go around Sabaody. Nami and Robin, I think, are going to go shopping to like pick up, do clothes shopping and pick up some supplies. And Hachan and Camie, and Pappag are actually being quite careful about this. Hachan is actually wearing like a giant coat to cover up most of his arms except for 2 of them, and he actually puts like a giant bandage over his, the mark of the sun on his forehead. And he, so he's like hiding that. They kind of like hide Pappag a little bit, and then like they put Camie in like a skirt to cover up her fishtail and put shoes on the end of her fins, so that way it just like she has like she has legs and feet as opposed to a tail fin, as opposed to having a mermaid tail, in order to hide that she is a mermaid. And they're like, why are you putting on those disguises? And he's like, well, let's just say Sabaody isn't necessarily the safest place for fishermen and merfolk to be. And it's not the best place. So they're like, okay. So they end up on like the bubble chariots as like they're going around, and they giving Camie's having fun. They're all having fun and enjoying themselves and all of that stuff. Zoro's wandered off because Zoro. So essentially they end up having a couple of different groups that they're in, and then they end up having the incident where they end up encountering the slave and the world nobles. So, as they're going around, like, they're having, like, this great time in Sabaody, and they're in, like, the much more public areas, like the tourist-friendly areas. Unfortunately, some of those tourists are the world nobles. And, like, Hachan has even warned them about, like, the much darker aspects of Sabaody, so you have to be careful with where you go. We have snow outside. Let's see how long that sticks around. Not the best weather today. Far from the worst. So, they end up hearing this guy screaming. Devil Diaz is his name. And he is a slave. He's a former pirate. He's running around in the area of Sabaody where they are, and he is screaming about trying to get someone to try to get this collar off of him before it explodes. And Hachan knows instantly what is going on, and he like grabs Luffy and the others and Camie, and he's like, okay, you need to kneel down right now and do not look at what is going on right now. And he's like having Camie cover her eyes. And it's like, do not watch, do not interact with this, do not do anything to these people that we are about to see, because these are the world nobles. And the and like the collar on Devil Diaz explodes because it's the exploding collars that are supposed to kill the person, or at the very least injure the person who is wearing it, the disobedient slave. And then we get our introduction to the world nobles. And we are introduced to Saint Roswald, who is an idiot, and Saint Roswald Shalria, who is his daughter. This is, of course, Charlos's father and sister. We will meet Charlos, unfortunately, later in this video. And we end up meeting 2 celestial dragons. Roswald has continued to clearly show himself to be an idiot and horrible, although I will point this out, he does seem to love his children. I will point that out. Does seem to care about Charlos more than we've seen some other celestial dragons care about their children, so I'll give him that much. Shalria is a celestial dragon that we are still like, okay, she seemed to show some like questioning of something during the most recent stuff that we saw her in the manga and in the anime in regards to Vegapunk's message, but again, we're not sure. She has demonstrated pretty much the same tendencies as her father and brother, and we're going to see that in a moment here. So what ends up happening is this whole scene that they are watching is just, it's making Camie sick. And it's, you know, Devil Diaz, the collar explodes. He's lying on the ground, either very close to dying. So the, you know, Shaoria just I believe it's Shaoria, just walks over and shoots him. Yeah. And then they just keep walking. Her and her father just keep walking, making their way to the auction house. And Camie is just so sick by this scene that they saw. Fair. So the group go off and they kind of wait. And like Hotshot is like, no, you cannot do anything. You cannot do anything. You cannot do anything to help in this at all. Otherwise it will result in you receiving the same fate. And like you can see Luffy like just wants to run over there and attack them and save like the person who was, you know, hurt and who got shot and all of that stuff. And so we see that. But like Hachan holds him back. Hachan is like, you cannot do that. And then we get the explanation that those are the world nobles, and like Camie, like Pappag and Hachan essentially explain who the world nobles are to us as a reader. Now, given the fact that the world nobles within One Piece are like, you know, one of the highest echelons of the world government and the way that everything is set up, it makes sense that Luffy isn't particularly aware of them. Given what we now know about Brook and possible connections to Gunko, Brook probably knows very much who the Celestial Dragons are, one way or the other. Pappag clearly knows who they are. Fishmen and Merfolk are very much made aware of who Celestial Dragons are. Chopper not knowing who they are makes a fair amount of sense. But like Luffy not knowing who they are, again, makes sense. That's not really something that Luffy pays attention to. But I think it's implied that, you know, Robin definitely knows who they are. I would assume Nami is aware of who they are. Zoro doesn't seem to know who they are. Some of the others, I don't remember if Usopp or Frankie kind of seem to know who they are, but whatever. You know, differing levels of like how much they've paid attention to stuff like that out in the world. But so the others are like trying to calm Camie down, and they're like, okay, it's okay. It'll be fine. I know that was a horrible scene, but it's okay. And then they start making their way to where Shaki's bar is, the rip-off bar. And we are introduced to Shakuyaku for the first time in the story. Love Shaki. And, you know, we find out that she is this old acquaintance of Hachan because Hachan saved Rayleigh from when Rayleigh almost drowned. Hachan saved him when Hachan was a little kid. And so there's like that kind of friendship there. And then of course, like, you know, she's like, oh yeah, Ray-san isn't here right now. He's off somewhere like bunked up with some random girl or whatever. I love you, Shaki. Oh, just great. So what ends up happening is she's like, yeah, no. And then like, this is where we get like this whole big explanation of the supernovas, where like that Luffy and Zoro are supernovas, and that there's these 9 pirates that are the supernovas, and blah 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 blah. And you know, this is who they are, blah 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 blah, the super rookies, all of that. And like, so we get through the introduction of all of them with like Shaki being the one to explain it to them, and all of that. So they're like, well, you'll have to go and find Rayleigh. So they end up setting out to go look for Rayleigh. And of course, they end up deciding to go to the theme park because that's where they say that, well, Rayleigh likes to hang around there sometimes. So that's where they go first. And so Camie's getting to have like this really fun time at the theme park, which is just great. Going on a bunch of these different rides. And we get this great moment where she's on the Ferris wheel with like Luffy and the others. Just like having a whole bunch of fun there. Unfortunately, there ends up being a moment where they end up having a bit of a skirmish with another group, and they end up it ends up being that like one of Camie's shoes falls off her tail, So it's kind of like, oh, that's not good. And the wrong people saw this. And so what ends up happening is during the excitement of everything, at one point in time, one of, this guy dressed as a giant, I think he's dressed as a bear or a rabbit, shows up, and he ends up kidnapping Camie for the kidnapping gang Hound Pets. They then end up taking Camie. They then end up taking her to the human auction house in Grove 1. And horrible, horrible place run by a horrible, horrible man named Disco. And she is like fighting back, trying to, like, I don't want to be here. She's trying to fight back. They're trying to put the collar on her, and she's like, fighting against them. And they end up kind of like beating her a bit because of her behavior. At one point, Disco gets knocked out because sitting right back in that area is Rayleigh, is the Dark King Rayleigh. And he used his Supreme King Haki, or his Conqueror's Haki, in order to knock out Disco. Very targeted little blast there. But given how much we know about how much Rayleigh knows about Haki at this point in time, it makes sense that he would be able to just focus it on that one person, specifically on Disco at that moment. So Rayleigh, we never actually find out the full reason why Rayleigh is there. We know Rayleigh likes to gamble and ends up getting into debt a lot, and then I guess like he will sell himself into slavery, get the money for that, use it to pay off his debt, and then like free himself, or whatever the case may end up being. We don't know how many times he's done this ploy to who knows how many other slavers, but whatever. And he's so he's at the auction house at that point in time. And Camie unfortunately does end up getting put into this it's a giant tank, and it's so disturbing how this is done. This whole thing is disturbing. But the tank that she is in is designed to look like one of those little bags that you can win at like the carnival that has like the fish inside of it. Because that's what they are viewing her as, this little prize to be won type of a thing. So what ends up happening is, of course, Camie is at the auction house. She has the exploding collar on her neck. She is chained inside of this container. And as they're going through the rest of the auction and everything else like that, and like she is like this big prize, like her and the giant that we learn later is Stanson, that is connected to Hyrudine and everything else like that, and is currently involved in the Elbath arc. But what ends up happening is we have this moment where Camie is still in the back. They're waiting to bring her on stage, and one of the previous slaves, he tries to off himself by biting his own tongue, only to be because he doesn't want to be sold as a slave. And that would just be a horrible thing to have to watch. And then they bring Camie out on stage in the tank. And while all of this is going on, of course, Pappag is worried out of his mind about what's going on with Camie, and the Straw Hats have been trying to figure out where Camie is, where Camie got taken to. Duval and the rest of the Rosy Life Riders have showed up, and they are helping them be able to figure out where Camie is. They're like, okay, according to our network, we know that Camie is at the auction house, so we need to get to the auction house. The Straw Hats are at the auction house already, or a good chunk of them are. And Nami has decided that they are going to try to cause as little problem as they can at the moment by just using the money that they had to try to buy Camie. So that way they don't need to cause a scene. So they don't need to worry about causing a scene and causing problems. Unfortunately, and like Nami feels disgusting about having to do this, but they are doing it in order to try to save Camie. And like Hachan and Pappag are there. They're trying to help with like what's going on. Like they are so worried. Pappag is just so worried about Camie. And like Camie, when she's in the tank, she can see the Straw Hats there. And they did like this whole like big performance type, big show performance thing to get her on stage and everything else like that to hype this up. And so we're getting all of that. And what ends up happening is, so Nami and the others are like, okay, we're going to try to get Camie and then we'll free her. unfortunately, what happens is that um, Charlo shows up, and he walks into the auction house, and like he just bids this enormous amount of money. It's like 500 million berry in order to buy her. And he like just states it was like, oh, I'm going to put her into a tank full of piranha and watch as they chase her. Is his intention, because he is a sick, sick, sick son of a bitch. And so that's his intention. And like Camie is there, and like they know that they cannot, try to win Camie fair and square now, because there's no way they can match that. Plus, he's a world noble. He would have unlimited amount of money to spend on this. And so what ends up happening is Frankie has been in the back trying to find the keys for the, the exploding, collars and everything else like that, so they can free Camie that way. So good job there. That's what Frankie's been working on. And what ends up happening is, of course, this is where we have the whole Luffy punching Charlo's incident. Camie is, of course, she is so terrified as to what is going on. Luffy and Zoro come in, crash into the building, and they cause this huge ruckus, and they're trying to get to Camie. In the middle of everything, Hachan gets shot by Charlos. And, it's revealed that he's a fishman, and Charlo shoots him and everything else like that. As I have stated, if it wasn't for the fact that, like, most of the world nobles that are not the God's Knights carry around guns, pretty sure I would be able to handle most of them in a fight. And no, I would not skip hitting the family jewels, as the case would be for any of the men. Because, nope, they deserve it. So what ends up happening is, of course, this is where we have the horrible moment where Hachan is shot. Camie is just horrified by this. Hachan is lying on the stairs bleeding. And Hachan tries to stop Luffy from going after Charlos, but Luffy is like, no, you are my friend, and he just shot you, so screw this guy. Punches Charlos, has one of the best animated moments in the series. Love this moment. And, Charlos gets punched out. Roswell gets landed on by Usopp and knocked out. And so we have this whole thing going on there. Then there's a couple of other things that happen. I believe it's Zoro uses one of his techniques to slice open the tank that Camie is in. To kind of, it does undo some of her chains, but she still got the collar on her and everything. But the tank is now open, and she's going to be much easier for them to get to. Frankie is still in the back trying to find the keys. Rayleigh and a bunch of the other slaves are still kind of watching what's going on here. And Shaoria has essentially technically decided to do the smart move here of, well, if all of you are trying to get this girl, then I'm just going to end her now, and then you have no other reason to try to go after her. This whole thing is done. Technically, that is the quote-unquote smart move to be done, but thankfully she gets knocked out by a burst of Conqueror's Haki from Rayleigh, who just knocks her out. He then walks over, and we get the scene where he is, him and Stanson are there, and a bunch of the other slaves are there. And Camie is just so terrified because, like, the collar is starting to tick. And Rayleigh is able to, like, we get the scene where it's just like the collar is there, and we have Rayleigh standing there with Camie, and then the collar is gone, and there was an explosion in the background because he was able to collar gone type of a thing. And that is just one of the best moments of showing off what Haki used properly can do. So they get the collar off Camie. Pappag and Camie are reunited. Hachan is being treated for his wounds, and then Rayleigh just does this huge burst of Conqueror's Haki throughout the rest of the building in order to knock out pretty much any of the other people that are there to bid. Law and Kid are there with their crews. They all manage to stay awake through this Conqueror's Haki blast, as do the Straw Hats and the rest of the slaves. The rest of the slaves, of course, end up getting freed at this point in time. Stanson and the rest of them end up getting freed because Frankie found the keys. So they're, they get the other slaves all freed, and they're able to get out of there. So we get that. Stanson, of course, shows up later. And what else ends up happening is, of course, now we got to get out of here because now we have more problems because Luffy punched the Celestial Dragon. And so they're like, okay, so we got to get out of the auction house. So they work on getting out of the auction house. Camie and Pappag are being like carried by Frankie, while Hachan is being carried by Rayleigh. And they're able to get out. Luffy, Kid, and Law team up for the first time, and they're like dealing with the Marines out front while the others are all escaping and everything. They do end up having to deal with Kuma, the PX Kumas, the pacifistas, and then they do end up being able to get past them. Thankfully, Duval and the others show up, and they are able to help get the rest of them away. So that way they can get back to Shaki's ripoff bar, where they all kind of end up. And then Camie is there, mostly just kind of tending to Hachan while they are listening to Rayleigh and the others tell them about the fact that he was on Roger's crew, that he was Roger's, second in command, the co-captain, all of that stuff. And they're just like, oh my God. And like, so Camie is like there while all of this is happening. And then they find out that Admiral Kizaru, has been sent to the island. And they're like, oh, that's not going to work. It's going to take me like 3 days to get your ship coded. So you guys kind of got to avoid capture until then. So the Straw Hats all kind of split up at that point in time. They bid farewell to Camie, Pappag, Hachan, and Shaki. They will end up seeing all of them again. It's just going to be about 2 years before that happens. They say goodbye to them. And then Camie and the others kind of stay at they're staying at the ripoff bar for a little bit while Hachan's recovering. They do, of course, end up being very worried when everything happens with the Straw Hats being all like separated up and sent away and everything like that by Kuma. And they're all very worried about that. And they pay attention to what's going on with like the, Marine Ford and everything else like that, because the post-war arc, post-Marine Ford arc, where we are, we cut back to Sabaody. This is after like the whole plan has been made between Luffy and Rayleigh and such about like, Rayleigh's going to train Luffy for 2 years on Ruskaina, blah, 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 the 3D2Y setup. So what ends up happening from there is essentially, Camie, Pappag, and Hachan, who is recovering a bit more at this point in time, they, along with the Rosy Life Riders and Shaki, have kind of been protecting the Sunny because, of course, there's a bunch of gangs that are showing up and trying to get to the Sunny, and we know eventually Marines are going to be a problem with that. We also know eventually that Kuma shows up, and he stays and he helps protect the Sunny for the next 2 years until Frankie shows back up again. So during this whole time frame, they're like, Camie and the others are like, well, then they're going to have to go to Fishman Island once they get back here. Yeah. So what are some of the things we want to show them in Fishman Island? And she's like, well, I want to show them the Mermaid Cafe. And Pappag's like, well, they're going to need to meet the Mermaid Princess. So, name drop of or not quite name drop of Shirahoshi, but, Shirahoshi mentioned. And so it's like that type of a thing where they're just like, okay, well, we're going to plan this list. And we do know that Camie and Pappag kind of head off with their lives. Hachan kind of travels back and forth between Fishman Island and Sabaody at that point in time to help keep the ship safe, as well as Kuma and the Rosy Life Riders. So we have that. Then we cut to during the time skip. During the 2-year time skip is when Pappag hits it big, where the criminal brand just takes off, and Pappag just becomes so wealthy, and he's living in like the Grooverly Hills in Fishman Island, and like the criminal brand is like everywhere and everything else like that. So he's just got like all of this stuff. And Camie has ended up going to work at the Mermaid Cafe, but she still visits Pappag like pretty much every day, even though they don't live together. She goes and visits him at like his giant house or whatever in Grooverly Hills, and ends up giving him, still brings him clams and stuff like that. So they're still like best friends type of a thing. All of that. So then we get to the Fishman Island arc. And when we get to the Fishman Island arc, we have it that Camie is actually the one who saves Luffy, and it ends up Usopp, Sanji, and Chopper, of course, here as well, when the Sunny is trying to get into Fishman Island, and there's a bit of an issue there. Camie shows up. She's like, I'm sorry, I forgot. I was going to meet you guys at Sabaody, but unfortunately, I got the month wrong. So they're in her house, and she's like making them seaweed soup, but that's not going to warm them up until she does the face fault again. And then, of course, we are introduced to the Medeca mermaid quintuplets, which is, the 5 of them. So we're introduced to all of the 5 little ones. And, Camie's the one who takes care of them and everything. And I don't remember exactly, because they're not her daughters. And I don't think they're stated to be her sisters. Cousins? I don't know, but she's in charge of taking care of them. Whatever the case may be. I don't think there's a relationship there. But she takes care of them. And, Camie, of course, has grown up again. She's 18 at this point in time in the story, since this is, the more current time. And, of course, Sanji just thinks she's, gotten even more beautiful and everything. And they're like, we're going to, we're going to go visit, the Mermaid Cove and everything else like that, which is just like Sanji's dream. And of course, they do go visit the Mermaid Cove, and they start getting to see around Fishman Island, which just looks awesome. They go to the Mermaid Cove, where they get to meet a bunch of Camie's friends, because like some of them work at the Mermaid Cafe too. Plus, they're just friends of Camie's. And then of course, that's when the princes show up. And of course, they try to hide the Straw Hats because they think the princes are going to be angry at the Straw Hats, or that they're there to like capture the Straw Hats, because miscommunication. And what ends up happening is, of course, when Sanji gets the nosebleed, the monstrous nosebleed, because stuck on an island for 2 years with nothing but Okama in his time is hell. I'd be like, oh, maybe they can help me learn how to use makeup. I'm good with that. So what ends up happening is, of course, Sanji is now dying from blood loss, and they need to figure out what to do. So they're like, okay, they have like the gondola that the princes arrived on. Camie essentially hijacks that by talking to like the eel thing. That's the thing that is in charge of the gondola. She hijacks it, and they get Sanji on it, and they're like getting him to where they can to try to do a blood transfusion. This is, of course, where we find out that there is this big issue between fishmen and humans, fishmen and merfolk and humans, when it comes to exchanging blood, even if they are compatible. This is where we have that issue, because like they need to find a blood type match for Sanji. Thankfully, they end up doing it. It's to Okama, which he's terrified about, but reasons. And so they are able to help Sanji. And then it's like, okay, well, why don't we go and find the others? So they end up finding Brook later. They also end up going to where, Pappagoo is. And we also, of course, are told that, like, that Luffy, of course, wants to see Jinbei. And Luffy informs him that Jinbei's not on the island at present. It's like, oh, sad Luffy. We find out later that this is a lie. Jinbei is there. He's just trying to keep Luffy and the others out of trouble. So essentially what ends up happening is, of course, they're like, okay, well, now we're going to go and we're going to introduce you guys to Madame Shirley. So they're at the Mermaid Cafe, and they take them through, and they go to the Mermaid Cafe, where they are introduced to Madame Shirley, who Luffy, of course, promptly insults by asking her if she poops, because reasons, and Camie is very embarrassed by that. And, Camie works at the Mermaid Cafe, so she, of course, knows Madame Shirley. She's, of course, one who tells everybody that Madame Shirley is, like this psychic, that she can predict the future, and that it's always come true and everything. That's, of course, later on they end up running into Brook and Pappagoo, and she's, Camie gives Pappagoo clams because reasons. We, of course, are then also informed about Vanderdeck in the Ninth, and how he causes problems. We learn that Fishman Island is under the protection of Big Mom at that point in time. So we're getting just kind of, information as they're traveling. They then make their way to the Criminal Brand store that, Pappagoo is in charge of. And this is where they end up coming across Nami is here. And of course, Nami is able to like swindle Pappagoo essentially out of like so many clothing. And Luffy, Usopp, and Brook are here for it. Chopper too are all here for it, and they just all take a huge amount of clothing, which is just funny. Don't actually know if we end up seeing them in very much of it later on or not, but it's still funny. Just like, nope, they got a whole bunch of free clothing now because of Papago, because Nami swindled him. So we get that. And then the princes show up, or the king shows up, Neptune shows up, and he invites the Straw Hats to the palace, and they're like, okay, sure. And they head to the palace. Camie and Papago go with them. And Camie and Papago are just like, oh my god, we're going to go to the palace. This is so cool. But it's like, they said we could bring our friends, so you're our friends, so come on with us. Come with us. And, so they get to the palace, and Camie and Papago are just kind of there while a lot of the stuff is happening. And there's this is when so many other things are happening at the same time during the arc. But essentially what ends up happening is, because of miscommunication, the Straw Hats end up technically taking over the castle, and tying up the king, because so many different reasons. And big miscommunication. Camie and Papago are there while all of this is happening. Camie and Papago are there while all of this is happening. And they're just like, okay, well, what are we going to do now? This is not what we planned. Because they didn't want to do anything. Not that Luffy and the others know that much about the Neptune family. Not that Luffy and the others know that much about the Neptune family, but we, of course, end up finding out that they are a very good royal family, ruling family, and everything else like that for their citizens. So we have that. But we kind of don't know that quite yet. We're introduced to Shirahoshi during all of this because of Luffy and everything. And so we're getting some of that. So Camie's just kind of there while all of this is happening. And then eventually, because reasons, people get split up. Camie and Nami end up escaping the palace, and Camie is taking Nami to where Luffy is, where he took Shirahoshi. That's where they're going to go. And then Papago is stuck in the castle, and he ends up actually getting chased around by Brook's ghost that's popped out of his body, and that's just funny. For how we get to see that trick work for the first time, and it's just Papago being terrified of a ghost, because they need Papago to come to try to help get them out of the cage, because Brook, Zoro, and Usopp got put in a cage. And of course, all of this is happening at the same time when the Hody and his crew are trying to get into the castle, because Vanderdeck and the Ninth wants to get to Shirahoshi, the others want to get to this other stuff, they want to take over the castle, they want to get rid of Neptune, and blah 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 blah, hate, racism, all of that. So Camie is off with them, and they get to the sea forest, and Nami wants to meet Jinbei and ask him about his message about trying to not be involved with what's going on. They get to the sea forest, and Camie is there while, they get to meet Shirahoshi and everything else like that. And then Camie is there when, she learns more about, that, Jinbei is revealing that he knew Arlong and all this other stuff. So we're getting that explanation, and we get, the whole backstory with Otohime and Fisher Tiger and all of that. And, so Camie's sitting there and listening to this. And she would remember maybe bits of this from when she was a kid. But this is getting it more from someone who was there firsthand for a lot of it, in regards from Jinbei. And, of course, Jinbei's doing this to explain to Nami what happened and all of this other stuff, and give Shirahoshi, I guess, a little bit more information as to stuff that was going on with her mother. And technically it's to give information to Luffy, but whether or not Luffy is listening is completely left up for debate. And then when the story is all finished, Camie is very happy that Nami doesn't hold any resentment against Jinbei. Sanji is also there during this whole setup. I believe he ends up hearing part of this as well, as does Chopper. That is also when so there's other stuff that's going on here. They end up getting there's the Denten Mushi call that goes through, that it shows that like Hody is, trying to take over Fishman Island. He has the king and the princes and all of that stuff. And, they're going to do all of this, and they're going to start, messing with the citizens and everything else like that. And so that, it's going through that stuff. And what ends up happening is, of course, there's big misunderstanding between the Straw Hats and the royal family and all that other stuff, but the other stuff's gonna get taken care of. And Hody gives his horrible speech and everything, and Luffy wants to help. Jinbei doesn't want them to. Still comes down to, yes, they're gonna help. And unfortunately, there is this, we get the whole information about like some information about the Noah. We know that at some point Hachan shows up because he got very badly injured by Vanderdecken during a bunch of this. So he's very badly injured, so they're needing to give him first aid and all of that stuff. And Camie and Pappag and Hachan are not involved in the big battle that takes place between Luffy and Hody and the other Straw Hats and the rest of Hody's crew and everything, and dealing with the Noah and all of that stuff. They're not involved in it, but they're kind of watching as it happens. And what ends up happening is, of course, all of that ends up happening. And then Camie, and I'm thinking Hachi and Papagu, are at the castle for like the big banquet in honor of the Straw Hats after they helped defeat Hody and save Shirahoshi and the royal family and all of that stuff. So, Camie and Shirahoshi are kind of friends now, so we have that connection there. They're just having a lot of fun. They're all just, talking and everything else like that. And then later, Camie is at the Mermaid Cafe, and Charlie tells her that she's no longer going to like put stock in the prophecies that she does anymore. She's going to try not to have any more prophecies. And she of course, wants Camie to have, go and be able to say goodbye to her friends. And then the last time, I believe, canon-wise, that we have seen Camie, Hachan, or Papagu has been when they are sending the Straw Hats off, when they are leaving Fishman Island. They wish them luck in the new world. They say goodbye. They're so happy for them. They're very happy for them. I don't think we've seen them in any cutbacks to Fishman Island or any like cover page series. Like the Decks of the World or anything like that. I don't think we've seen them since then to see what they're up to. Yes, they have a cameo in Film Stampede, but that's not canon. They're like selling takoyaki at the Pirate Festival to like Conus and Isa. But we haven't seen them canon wise since. They would have been like them when like Vegapunk was doing his message, would have been a good time to show them. To be able to see what they were up to. Or, something else along those lines in one of the cover page series, like from the Decks of the World one. Seeing them there would have been nice. When they're in Fishman Island. But we haven't seen that. So, I don't know where they are. I'm assuming we'll see them again eventually. I'm assuming we'll see them again eventually. Just don't know when. But that's what we have here. I thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye.